Hello, everyone. This is Dan Barreto. I'm the President and CEO of PharmaQ Global Consulting Services. Today, I'm joined by Joseph Jimenez, a good friend of mine and an industry expert, who I have invited so that we can talk a little bit about the coronavirus crisis. Joe, how are you?
I'm doing well, Dan. Thanks for having me today.
Oh, it's great to have you here. So today I'm thinking that I'd like to spend some time with you, um, trying to also exploit a little bit about your background and experience, so that we could talk a little bit about what is it that a pharmaceutical company needs to do in the midst and after the coronavirus situation, because I think there's a lot of work that has to be done. So I'm very worried that perhaps there's not sufficient readiness out there to really tackle this issue, not only during the crisis, but after the crisis. Do you agree with me?
I do. I do. I think this virus is impacting, obviously, the entire global supply chain for pharma.
I totally agree with you. So, but before we go ahead, maybe Joe, I'd like to hear from you a little bit of your bio, so that our audience can tell who you are and what level of authority and expertise you bring to this discussion.
Sure. Thanks. I'm 25 plus years in pharma, trained as a chemist, started out on the bench, worked my way up through management. I've had a number of leadership roles across companies such as Pharmaceuticals, IVAX, Teva Pharmaceuticals, as well as Tissue Tech, and a joint venture, very successful joint venture with Procter & Gamble called PGT. This is across, obviously, multiple different types of products, such as pharma, OTC, human tissue, biologics, but also across regulatory, different regulatory markets, such as MHRA, Anvisa, TGA, EMA, as well as the US market with FDA.
Very impressive, Joe.
Thank you.
So maybe I can give a little bit of a summary of who I am and what do I bring to the table. So I spent about 19 and a half years of my professional experience with the US Food and Drug Administration. I did this in different capacities, mostly as an investigator, with expertise in pharmaceuticals, medical devices, biological products, and then I've spent the rest of my 42 plus years of experience working in the pharmaceutical industry. So I'm speaking about companies like Mediva Pharmaceuticals, Johnson & Johnson in Belgium and throughout Europe. I've also worked with the medical device companies like C.R. Bard. And then, of course, recently I've worked with Sanofi, and then up until recently, I just worked with Teva Pharmaceuticals. So I think we've got a little bit of knowledge and challenges and experience that we could use to talk about this. So Joe, the PC, as I call it, the PC wrap, or the post-coronavirus remediation action plan, is something that I've been thinking about. So I'd like to talk about that today. I think that every company does need a post-coronavirus a remediation action plan. Without it, I don't see how many companies will be able to sustain not only the internal challenges that they have to catch up and to get back into a state of control, but also to respond to regulatory authority expectations. Because I believe that after the coronavirus crisis is over, the regulators will be knocking on the door, and they will want to know what's going on, what have you done, where are you, and what is the plan that you have for remediating. I mean, do you see it the same way, or what do you think?
I do, and along the lines, let me bounce off of something you said. So fundamentally, the organizations are going to go through a number of challenges, both where they were prior to essentially the lockdowns, and then starting the business back up, but recognizing that's going to be a new world. So fundamentally, and I think this message needs to be made strongly, is that the GMPs don't go away. So in other words, we have rules on how we operate. However, I think this is an interesting time for companies to apply all their learnings and take, let's say, everything they put into place from their quality risk management SOPs, which essentially were in some cases, theoretical or nice pieces of paper to have to show to an auditor to actually put them into action, and maybe in a more innovative way. So in other words, from supply chain, if I may, Dan, from a supply chain perspective, to really understand from a process perspective, what are the key elements that are impacted by this? So true risk mitigation, and what are they doing to manage the pressures that will be on those pieces in a compliant fashion? Because I think the fundamental piece here will be getting the business back up, but doing it compliantly.
I totally agree with what you're saying, Joe. So, so let me just talk a little bit about the current situation. So, from my perspective, you know, most activities, critical and non-critical, are pretty much on hold. I mean,
Right.
basically, this issue is really putting a stop to a lot of things that have to be done on a day-to-day basis, but also things that are unplanned and the things that are to be scheduled. So from my perspective, there's really no predictive, pre-designed business continuity plan for this type of event. I'm sure that every company has a business continuity plan,
Right.
but something like this was not really considered before. Um, as a third point, I think that, you know, there is a significant level of absenteeism in production and quality assurance, and that's
Right.
caused by, you know, the fact that, you know, companies do have to limit the number of people coming in. People are going to get sick, whether themselves or their relatives, and then they have to really postpone coming into the office. So I think, you know, when you think about the current situation, you also have to look at what are going to be the consequences. And I think that the consequences of this is that there will be a significant backlog of work, not because the companies are causing it by, you know, intention, but because of the situation. So, and then the other thing is that's happening now. This is the current situation, Joe, is that there's a lot of work that is happening from remote locations, and that work may not be sufficient to identify and tackle all key issues. So one thing that I'm thinking of is, for instance, audits, right? Whether it's audits that you're performing of your suppliers or internal audits,
Right.
you know, you're going to do them from a remote location, but most companies don't even know how to do these. So even when they are done, I'm sure there is a certain level of deficiency associated with that. And then finally, the on-site supervision and oversight, I think it's going to be minimal, which means that this is going to create an overwhelming situation for the companies. Can you think of anything else that is really describing the current situation, Joe?
I might add, and I'm going to touch on some of the discussion you and I have had prior to this on the people aspect. So you mentioned absenteeism. I would say many organizations may not have true robust process maps for their manufacturing, including the whole supply chain. So have they identified what are those key steps in their processes that truly are people dependent? And let's say you have one or two skilled operators for a particular type of equipment. What's your backup plan? Are they appropriately trained? So in other words, have they identified what those risk elements are, what their mitigation plans are, what would happen, for instance, if in the middle of a process, let's say there's a manufacturing step that takes longer than one shift. So if the person who's supposed to come in is taken ill, what is the plan? What are their hold times? What was validated? What is actually in their documentation for their process steps? And I think this is going to take it to, from an auditing perspective, what does change control look like? How effectively do you manage the change control process? I think, Dan, one of the things, and you've seen this as a regulator, when we standardize our processes with our SOPs, obviously we've codified them. And I think sometimes in some organizations, there's like an entry that's very difficult to change. So one of the demands that's going to be on every organization is how they effectively manage change. And there needs to be some real innovation there to do it in a compliant fashion. So overhauling SOPs and what the impact is on that from an audit perspective. How do you ensure the timely signatures prior to the execution of the steps? So I think there's this is going to present a number of really fascinating challenges, actually, for not just the quality organizations in businesses, but as well as doing it to actually meet the market demands and get your product out on time, because people need these drugs now.
Joe, I think you've touched on such an important aspect of this discussion, because I think that the people aspect is so fundamental to companies getting back to a state of control. And you mentioned, and I mentioned absenteeism, but I think there are other factors, and maybe we should spend a few minutes to talk about this, because I think that
Sure.
as part of the PC wrap, I have a number of things that I call the P's, and
Right.
in this part, the people part is by far the most important one. So you touch on absenteeism, but think about the fact that even training of personnel, people are going to come back and they're going to have to really be trained again in certain areas. They're going to have some refresher training to get themselves back into a state of control. And number one. Number two is we talk about this post-coronavirus crisis remediation action plan. The people coming back will need to understand that there is such a plan in place
Right.
that's been designed and that they can execute. I think that the worst thing that any company could do is come back and pretend that we're going to start, to operate as this was business as usual, when in reality, this is going to require really for the companies to plan. So that part, a refresher training, training on this in this remediation action plan. In that remediation action plan, letting people understand, what is it that it needs to be prioritized. And a third element that I think it's important is, because of the absenteeism, what are companies going to do? Are they going to resort to bringing employees from other areas, whether it's from production, from quality, or from wherever, to compensate for the areas that are lacking? Are they going to bring people coming from other sites? Are they going to bring external people to come in and provide support? So they're going to have to think about that. Now, of course, we know that one of the issues that's going to get in the way is the fact that there's going to be a cost associated with
Sure.
using people, training people. But what my advice is that the last thing that any company could do is to really not pay attention to people, the people part, to make sure that they are the ones driving this process.
Yeah. I think fundamentally, Dan, if you look historically at a lot of the business management literature over the years, we say that people are the business's greatest asset. And I think in times like this, it's crystallized. It truly is. These operations will not work without the appropriately trained people. And you touched on many of the challenges that the organizations are going to face. Fundamentally, I think this plan you speak of, it needs to be protocol driven, and the implication there is not just that it's formalized, but that exercise of creating a protocol with a formal action plan forces the management team to really think through what those challenges will be, so that they have appropriate actions in place. So let's take a sterile manufacturing plant. So obviously we have procedures already in place for gowning, et cetera. One of the things that might be interesting right now is, given the virus, are those procedures adequate? So someone needs to take a look at what those controls are and determine, from an infrastructure perspective, do they actually have the right space? Are the exercises, maybe someone was qualified 6 months ago, but is that process still good enough to meet the current the current challenges that people are going to have?
Absolutely. Absolutely correct, Joe. And by the way, you touch on the next P of the remediation action plan, which is procedures. Having to take a look at it, and we have some ideas on how this should be implemented. But to finalize on the people part, I think that the important part that I see as critical to the success of any company with respect to the implementation of any remediation action plan is that it has to be done so that the people are not overwhelmed. There has to be a risk-based approach, because one thing that you're not going to be able to do is to do everything at the same time. You're going to have to prioritize. You're going to have to figure out what is it that I need to do first? And also you need to figure out how is it and where is it that you're going to do it. And the how is it, it's about making sure that you implement a certain level of simplicity, a certain level of practicality. You cannot go desperate. You cannot think
Right.
that, you know, the people who are coming back are going to be able to do everything at the same time. And keep in mind that this is important because, as we said at the beginning of the program, you will have to meet internal expectations, but I know and I'm sure that sooner rather than later, post the event, somebody from, whether it's the FDA or EMA or another regulatory agency, they're going to knock on your door and they want to know, where are you
Right.
with all of these activities? So I think that the people part is something that we can talk about. Now, we are sort of running a little bit out of time, Joe, because what I want to do is to limit this session to about 30 minutes for our audience, and then maybe we can do a follow-up project.
Sure.
Program, sorry. But what are the other P's that we should be talking about, Joe, when we come to the implementation of a remediation action plan? I'm thinking we talked about people, you touched on procedures, and I think this is extremely important aspect. But I'm also thinking performance, right? So you really have to be able to assess what is the level of performance that you will want out of the different programs that you have and the different activities that you do. And again, think about, 3, 6, and 9 months,
Right.
because to get to the certain level of performance that you want to have, it's not going to be overnight. It's going to take some time. So so we talk people, we talk procedures, we talk performance. What else do you think we should? What other piece do you think we should think about?
So I think maybe for our next discussion, Dan, we can talk on the product piece. So I'm thinking, obviously, it's a global pandemic by definition. Maybe that's redundant to say that. But if you think of from a DMF perspective, where our precursors come from, et cetera, China, India, Italy, which are where we manufacture a lot of APIs for drugs today, they're going to be very hard hit, if not hit hard already. When you talk about suppliers, will some of those businesses be in place? Keep in mind the typical audit schedule for a vendor for a critical aspect of your drug. Let's say API is an annual inspection or a biannual. Well, if you are within a cycle that maybe you won't be scheduled to audit them for a year from now, et cetera, I think it's important to reach out to those suppliers, and especially the precursor chemical manufacturers, to understand, are they still going to be in business, what their cash flow situation looks like, and make sure that you have redundancy built into your file. Keep in mind, these are registered suppliers. Do you have a backup plan? Is there an alternate? What happens to what's within the impact of that supply chain? How are you going to make sure that you still have a continuous flow in a compliant fashion? Again, going back to the GMPs, as we said from the outset, to ensure you have a future for your business, not just for that product, and you don't have to go to some other supplier where you may have, and you might have to actually. And again, how are you going to execute that audit in this brave new world with limited flights and other restrictions?
Joe, you couldn't be any more correct. But I'm also thinking about the fact from a product perspective that, there's going to be drug shortages, right?
Yeah.
So even as a manufacturer, when it comes from a product perspective, you need to start thinking about how do you put a remediation action plan that basically allows you to prioritize on the production of drug shortage related products so
Right.
that you can fulfill regulatory expectations. Now, the other aspect, the other piece that we could think about is also the importance of the companies having a process. So when we talk about a process, really companies understanding again, and also refreshing the expectations of what is an end-to-end activity, which I think sometimes is lacking. And finally, I'm thinking about productivity. I mean, in the end, in order for companies to get back, they really have to achieve this within a certain routine that allows them to be productive. And what I mean by productive is I'm thinking about simplification. I'm thinking about doing things in a practical way without overwhelming, whether it's a system or a process or the people. So that's what I'm thinking about, Joe. What do you, anything else you want to say about this?
Yeah, the only thing I might add is going back to the supply chain discussion. There's a challenge right now. If you look at some of the literature on the just-in-time manufacturing and whether that will still hold in the future for the pharmaceutical world. I think there will be some aspect of that, but given my background is heavy on generics, and a lot of these companies have grown through acquisition, many of these groups might actually have old dossiers, old ANDAs for products relating to your drug shortage question that they might want to dust off. So going back to the productivity piece, okay, so let's say you want to now introduce this dossier that you have, this asset, you want to revive it, given that, let's say, hydrochloroquine might be one of these products that has an exportation ban where it's primarily being manufactured now. So how do you bring your ANDA back to life? So you've got this asset that your legal department has been holding on with Reg Affairs. Now you want to bring it back. What about those suppliers? What about those analytical methods? What about the equipment? How did you qualify? What about that plant? You know, what does validation look like? You can't just skip validation. How are you going to risk manage that? And I think this concept of the post-corona risk assessment plan becomes absolutely critical, not just now in the short term, 3, 6, 9 months, 12 months, but everyone talks about this as a black swan event. I personally feel it's a little hackneyed to continuously call things lately black swans. We see a lot of black swans lately if they're so rare. And I think if you consider what the pressures might be in the future, we have to prepare for a world where periodically we may have breakdowns like this, not just viral outbreaks, but you could even have other politically sensitive issues impacting the global supply chain. So what does that look like in the future? So I think another discussion, Dan, like this is warranted.
I think, Joe, we're just probably touching on the initial stages of this discussion. So what I'm going to propose to you and to the audience is that we're going to do some follow-up work on this remediation action plan, and then we can share this with the rest of the industry. But not only from an educational part, but I think, Joe, people like yourself and myself could also provide certain level of support, even a remote level of support to any company who may find itself in need of this remediation action plan. I mean, when do you think is the right time to start thinking and preparing for this remediation action plan? Is that when the companies come back after the event, or is that now? What do you think?
I think it should be now. There are certain elements that will take some time to bring up. So there's a significant lead time for some of these things, but the thinking through the process by the thought leaders within the organization that hold those respective responsibilities, I think should occur now.
I totally agree with you, Joe. So I'm looking forward to the next conversation. In the meantime, if people wanted to do some one-on-one follow-up, whether with you, with me, or both of us, feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn. We're there. And I'm looking forward to the next conversation, Joe. So any last words for the audience?
No, Dan, thanks very much for inviting me to have this discussion with you. I appreciate it.
Okay, it was a pleasure. And everybody, we'll be talking with you in the near future. Take care.